The Washington correspondent for NewsNation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. For whoever is watching this is going to be shared on social media. Um, Typically, this is not my background. You normally see me on camera at the Capitol or somewhere else in Washington. We're doing this from home today. So what we're doing is we wanted to break down some of our exclusive NewsNation polling that we just did. Put a poll out in the field. And we were asking people a couple of questions about really the state of the economy, about approval ratings for the administration, and then a heavy focus on Ukraine and Russia and what's going on there. And we tackled that from all kinds of different angles. So we're going to go over the polling results that we got. We're going to break them down, maybe put them into context. And if there is time, we can answer some questions if anybody has. So yeah, we will go ahead and jump right into it. Remember, being on social media, this is a discussion. So if you have questions, the producers will try to get them to me, and feel free to be interactive. I'm going to turn that noise off so you won't hear that anymore. Okay, so the first is the basic approval rating of President Biden. We found a 56% who disapprove, 44% approval, and that's the number that we focus on, 44. Now, it's not great. That is, I think, he's underwater. So goes without saying that you want to hit 50 or above if you are a president at any time. If the White House is monitoring this, the positive spin they might put on it is that it actually has increased just over the past couple of weeks. At one point, at its lowest, President Biden was, I think, in the high 30s in some polls. NewsNation had him in the lower 40s. So it has just ticked up a little bit. And we can actually show the changes there. So, it kind of flat, the first sort of three lines there on the bottom, working your way up. Haven't moved too much, but there's a slight increase in support and a little dip, that sort of V shape that you see. That's, again, pretty subtle. That is a lot of people who I guess strongly disapproved at one point who've moved into the category of somewhat disapproving. So, just a slight tick up there. And the next numbers that we're going to get into really tell the story, because a lot of times a president's approval rating is tied to the state of the economy. And right now, the state of the economy, there's inflation, and we ask about that in a minute. First question here, how concerned are you about the COVID pandemic? So you see right there, 65% say that they are concerned in some way. Most of those people said somewhat concerned, 41%. Very concerned is 23%. Relatively good. I mean, we've been through this for the past 2 years or so, and at various points throughout the pandemic, those numbers were significantly higher. 35% who say that they're not at all concerned is pretty good. And you're getting a look at the trend lines there, trending downward. So again, good news. People are sort of, as we relax the mask mandates, the vaccination mandates in a number of big cities, I think there's sort of a return to normal life. You're seeing schools open, places open, and that sort of tends to, decrease the worry in that sense. So good news there. And I think that tracks with other polls as well. Now, we talked about President Biden's approval rating and why it may be so low. What do you think are the biggest problems facing the United States today? Inflation, unemployment, or COVID were the three options we gave people. And the biggest response by far was inflation. That's, again, what tracks with President Biden's approval rating is that nearly 70% of the people we talk to have serious concerns about inflation. And you're seeing that. It's almost impossible to go through daily life without noticing prices at the grocery store. Your gas tank, clearly prices are up. Inflation is a real thing. Everybody from the White House to Democrats in Congress to Republicans acknowledges that this is a problem. The president's trying to work through it. The White House is trying to work through it. But while it is here, people are worried about it. And that compares to, again, just smaller portions of people worried about unemployment or COVID. So when we actually get into how concerned people are about inflation, very concerned, 63% of people who responded. And you see the top line number is actually 95 and 5%, just not being concerned about this 5%. So everybody is feeling it. And again, this is one of those issues where you can't really get away from it unless you're one of these uber wealthy people, and you feel sort of immune to the inflation most Americans are feeling this in a very real sense. So not a big surprise there that 63% of people are very concerned about it, and at least 30% more are somewhat concerned about inflation right now. Let's go ahead and hit the next one. Better off or worse off financially than you were a year ago. This is also another one of those big indicators about where people are actually politically. This is used very often to gauge where a president is, where you are right now compared to where you were a year ago. And it's funny that we say that because, look, that almost tracks exactly. 45% worse off than they were a year ago. 20% are better off. Those numbers sort of track with exactly what we saw in terms of the president's approval rating. Not a surprise there. Again, that's something that everybody feels when we talk about things just cost more. So if you haven't gotten a salary increase in a year, it's sort of that belt tightening mode and period that we're going through right now. Who do you blame the most for the recent rises in gas prices? So here, what we're seeing is that there is at least some concern about what's happening in Russia right now. Clearly, we know that is going to contribute to the way that gas prices have increased. It's not the entirety of it, but certainly that plays a role. But what you're seeing from this poll is that the public generally, 32% or 33% there, they hold the administration accountable. And that's, again, not surprising. We saw that that inflation, high gas prices were going up before the war in Ukraine broke out. So not entirely surprising to see that some people are presenting President Biden there with 33% of blame, 28% or 29% going to Russia. And then you've got a couple of smaller factors there. But I mean, those are the two big ones. And, the reality of it is COVID, and certainly we've had supply chain issues. That plays a role. Russia, in a certain sense, plays a role as well. So you have a lot of factors, and it's interesting to see how Americans attribute those things. Would you favor or oppose President Biden signing an executive order to restart construction on the Keystone XL pipeline? Let's stay with this one for a little bit, guys. I want to get into this a little bit more in depth. 69% favor restarting construction on the Keystone pipeline, 31% opposed. The Keystone pipeline itself, if you're not familiar, it was a pipeline that was designed to carry crude oil from Alberta in Canada all the way through the U.S. into Nebraska. Now, a couple of we'll break down myths and truths about the Keystone pipeline. It's a politicized thing. And typically, when that happens, you've got voices on the right and the left yelling about stuff. The truth falls somewhere in the middle, and I think that's the case here. The Keystone pipeline is not and would not be a all-purpose solution for this problem. Why? Only 8% of it is actually done right now. When President Biden came into office last year, he stopped construction on it. But even if he continued construction on it, there's a chance it would not be done right now. And even if we were to restart construction today, most estimates are that between 3 and 4 years from now, that's when oil would actually start flowing. So if you restart it today, in the short term, it doesn't exactly solve this problem. On the other hand, you hear the White House talk about how Keystone XL pipeline wouldn't solve problems because there are still permits that oil companies have today, and they're not drilling. They have permits to drill on certain lands. They're not drilling. When you dig into that a little bit, you realize that a lot of these oil producers cannot drill right now or will not drill because it's not going to be profitable. There are a number of policies that were put in place that make it harder to drill right now for oil. And for that reason, some of these oil companies have been hesitant to do it. Now, all of that taken together may be a little bit complicated, but usually it's important for you all to understand the Keystone pipeline itself sometimes gets politicized, and it's more a symbol of, climate action versus producing energy in the United States. And it's a little bit more complicated than just presenting it in that simple way. So I wanted to get into it before we move on with that. Anyway, interesting to see the responses there. So generally, we're about to wrap up some of the political stuff. This is if the election were held today, who in Congress would you vote for? Generic Republican or generic Democrat? we're a very split, very divided country right now, and you've got 41 Republican, 39 Democrat. So actually, I think within the margin of error, it's basically split with just a tight edge for Republicans now. And when a president is relatively unpopular, under 50% approval, sometimes you see numbers like this. So that's it sort of explains why we see those numbers there. Which of the following do you think is a bigger threat to the United States? Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Afghanistan, and a couple of others, plus a not sure option. 50%, 51% of people responded that Russia was the biggest threat to the United States today. Now, obviously, this is tracking with the news about the war in Ukraine. I imagine that if you didn't have that situation right now, if Vladimir Putin never ordered an invasion to Ukraine, the numbers for China and possibly for Iran and North Korea may be a bit higher than they are now. But we're dealing with the current global threat. Now, is Russia going to attack the United States on American soil? That is incredibly unlikely. But when you talk about cyber attacks, those are things that we have seen in the past from Russia just recently in the past. So something like that certainly could happen in the United States. And again, it's not surprising, in my view, that so many people have Russia top of mind, given what we're seeing right now in Ukraine. And let's continue this. So that it sort of explains it again. The numbers have increased in that sense as well. Let's go ahead into the next one, guys. How closely have you been following the news about the Russian invasion in Ukraine? So look at these numbers here. This, I think, to me, really stood out. And we focused, if you watch Morning in America, our morning show on NewsNation, we focused a lot on these couple of questions that we're about to see. 83% of people say they have either very much been following or somewhat following. Typically, I think Americans, there's this reputation maybe that they're not so interested, that we are not as in tune with foreign affairs, with foreign policy. We're much more in tune with things that are happening domestically. But in this case, look how many people are following what's happening in Ukraine. 83% right now. And I think it's largely because it's really hard to ignore some of the images from social media, what you're seeing on TV every night. Americans have a sense of general fairness, and international affairs and international conflicts can be really complicated, but there's a simplicity about one country with very little justified reason invading another country and killing civilians. I think that speaks to Americans' basic sense of fairness, that we realize something about that makes you angry. And I think that's partly why, the real striking images, victims, children who've been killed, who've had to flee their homes, it's really grabbing and keeping America's attention. So I thought that was interesting. Do you believe that the U.S. has done too much, too little, or just enough to help Ukraine? I want to start with the too much number, that we've overreacted to it, just 13%. So not a lot of people prescribe to that view. Too little, 41% of Americans that we've talked to here think we have not done enough, and 45% think that we have done just enough. That 41% number sticks out to me because that to me seems high, that if you imagine really that 41% of people think the U.S. needs to do more, and that generally the West needs to do more to help Ukraine. Let's go to the next one. How confident are you that Ukrainian military will win against Russia? So this sort of split right down the middle for us, 50-50. Ukraine was the underdog in this story. Russia came in with a vastly larger military. They've got a lot more weapons, people, resources to work with. And Ukraine, if they have an advantage, it's that they have a sense of purpose, a very clear sense of purpose. And frankly, in a good way, they've sort of surprised the world at how tough, how resilient they have been. You've seen people who are not at all military trained that have just decided to pick up arms and defend their own country. And every report from the Pentagon on down has shown that the Russian offensive has stalled. And they've been surprised at their own sort of lack of coherence. Part of that may be Russia's lack of will on the ground. It may be their tactical, issues that they have had. But a large part of this, if you hear the experts talk about it, is the fact that Ukraine really surprised people and their military has stood really strong, both strategically and just in a sense of will, of not quitting, of not being deterred in the face of a much larger invading force. Would you favor or oppose deploying United States troops into the conflict? Again, this number surprised me. 42% favored putting American troops into the conflict. I think the question was, if sanctions don't work, would we support American troops on the ground? That number, again, to me, for a country that says, that maybe there's this perception that Americans are war weary after 20 years in Afghanistan and after years in Iraq, that we don't want American boots on the ground. I mean, certainly that is true. Most people, 58%, oppose this idea. But 42% of people say that they would support this conflict if we put American troops on the ground. To me, that number was surprising that was high. 15% strongly favored that, by the way. Would you approve or disapprove of a no-fly zone? NATO enforced no-fly zone. Okay, we're going to ask the question on the surface, just yes or no, would you approve it? And this is what we got. 68% said that yes, they would approve it. I want to caveat this by saying just about every American leader, from President Biden on down to every member of Congress, our defense officials, our military, all of them oppose this idea. And they've made very clear there is not going to be a no-fly zone, because that would mean essentially we would have to shoot down Russian jets, and effectively that would put us on a direct war path between the United States and Russia, NATO and Russia, two superpowers, two powers that have nuclear weapons. So at all costs, the U.S. wants to avoid it. But take a look at this next question, because we did what I just did, and we put the caveat in. Would you support a no-fly zone knowing that it could mean war between Russia? As you see, when we put that clarification in there, the numbers came down a bit. 52% approved, but that still seems pretty high. 52% knowing that it could be direct war, Russia and the United States, still would approve a no-fly zone over Ukraine to help them defend their skies. So to me, that was an interesting one there. When it comes to the relationship between President Biden and President Vladimir Putin of Russia, the war in Ukraine has mainly, most people think that it has kept things about the same, but more people think it's increased Putin's power. Less people think it's increased Biden's power. And this one actually really surprised me, because Vladimir Putin now has isolated himself from the entire world. If he was a pariah before this, in a small way, he certainly in a big way is a pariah now. The entire world essentially has mobilized together to sanction Russia, to condemn what's happening in Russia. It's not a two sides issue. Most of the world has sort of been mobilized. And in a big way, what you hear even Republicans say is that they give President Biden credit just on this point, that he was able to sort of bring our NATO allies, our European partners together and sort of unite them against this Russian aggression. So I would have anticipated maybe these numbers to be different. But anyway, that's the result that we got. 37% of people think Putin has been more emboldened by this. President Biden said Russia is going to end up paying a price for its invasion. So far, that price has been, most people think, too weak. Almost 60% of respondents said that the price Russia has paid is too weak. And again, I think what that speaks to is people seeing the images of war, people seeing the images of what's happening in Ukraine, devastation, civilians being killed on a daily basis, and realizing that Russia's not stopping, that maybe the sanctions haven't gone far enough to deter Russia from stopping. Clearly, we've talked just minutes ago about people supporting no-fly zones. They want to see more accountability for Russia in this conflict. The conflict is not over. We'll have to see how things progress, but certainly strong support there for, or not, I shouldn't say support, but a strong consensus that Russia hasn't paid a strong enough price yet. How concerned are you about the use of chemical warfare in future conflicts? This is a risk that's very real. And look at that number right there. 90% of people said they're either somewhat or strongly concerned that chemical warfare is going to enter into this conflict and possibly future conflicts. When we talk about chemical weapons, we're talking about biological weapons, things that could, we saw this in Syria in 2013, 2014, and the images are just horrific. People end up struggling just to breathe. They're sort of choking on gas that's in the air, and people die in a large way. And with these weapons, just one or two attacks could go well beyond Ukraine and into other parts of Europe as well. We're talking about things that are incredibly dangerous, that by all accounts are absolute war crimes. These are crimes against humanity if these are to be used. And again, the reports, even President Biden just said yesterday that the threat is very real, that something like this might happen. So there is a big concern there, 90% of people. Anyway, that is the bulk of our poll. We went through almost every question there. There may be a little bit left of it, but you can check it out on newsnation.com. You can, I encourage you to check out the story that we did this morning, putting some of that into a broader context. If you've got questions, you can leave them. It won't be live, me responding to them, but I'll come back later to the post on Facebook. And if I see any questions dropped underneath, I will go back and try to type an answer to them. Anyway, thank you so much for your time. And thank you for giving us an opportunity to explain and lay out how we did our polling and the questions we asked, the responses we got. Thank you to all of those who got a phone call and participated in our poll. And hopefully we'll do this again soon. Thank you.